At 12 noon on July 20th, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg enters the office complex of Field Marshal Keitel at Wolfschanze, the Führer's headquarters for the Eastern Front in East Prussia. He is scheduled to report to Hitler on the readiness of the home army. Keitel informs the officers that the briefing will not take place in the bunker as usual, but in the nearby conference room of the Lagerbaracke, the situation barracks. Keitel beckons the officers to follow him, but Stauffenberg stops and asks if he can change his shirt. Keitel's aide, John von Freyend, takes him to a nearby bedroom. While Stauffenberg is inside, the phone rings. It is General Feldgiebel, head of the communications post. Stauffenberg says he will call back as soon as possible. Now Keitel gets impatient. Stauffenberg emerges at last, and the officers continue on their journey to the conference room, located on the other side of the inner security zone. At 12:35 p.m., Stauffenberg enters the conference room. Exactly 7 minutes later, the world is shattered. Thus begins one of the most astonishing chapters in the history of World War II, an assassination attempt on the Führer by a group of senior officers at the very pinnacle of German military might. This is the untold eyewitness story of Operation Valkyrie. By 1934, 1 year after his appointment as Chancellor, Hitler was the undisputed master of Germany. All the opposition parties in the Reichstag had been outlawed, with most of the party leadership in jail. Hitler's National Socialist or Nazi Party was now in full control of the country. When the Reich President, the Venerable Paul von Hindenburg, conveniently passed away, Hitler combined the office of Chancellor and the President into one new position, that of Führer, supreme leader of the German nation. Anticipating opposition from the Church, Hitler had concluded a concordat with the Vatican in 1933, thus preempting any criticism from the Catholic Church. But individual priests and Protestant clergy did speak out, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, and Bishop Clemens von Galen.
Hitler started to kill mentally and physically handicapped children in killing centres around Germany. These killing centres were actually the apprenticeships for the people who would go on to run the death camps. And Galen found out about this, and it was Galen, most of all, speaking from his pulpit, who got this stopped.
Eben der Dietrich Bonhoeffer, der bekannte Theologe, und gegen deren Einstellung war eben dieses ganze System.
There was a split actually within the Protestant Church, because one side of the Protestant Church became very loyal to the regime, as actually the Protestant Church always had been. And another part broke away, which is where Niemöller and Bonhoeffer found themselves.
There was very little, although there were courageous priests and courageous pastors who spoke up on humanitarian issues, and some of these attacked and condemned the persecution of the Jews. The churches as institutions did not do that, and they confined themselves therefore largely to their own affairs.
The Catholic Church tended to be a little more distanced from whatever the regime was, and that goes back into its history, that the Catholic Church always had a loyalty to somewhere else.
There were other resistance movements, such as the White Rose, which originated at Munich University. But the impact of these groups was minimal, since most of their leaders were tracked down by the Gestapo, the German security police, and removed from the scene. But the resistance that ultimately proved to be the most effective originated right where the Gestapo least expected it, in the hierarchy of the German Wehrmacht. The first seeds of resistance were sown in the organization known as the Abwehr, German military intelligence, as well as the office of General Ludwig Beck, Chief of the General Staff. For the first 4 years, most of these officers supported the Hitler regime. But all that changed in 1938. Hitler had spent millions rebuilding Germany's military forces to create a vast German Reich that would bring new Lebensraum, new living space, to its citizens. But many officers on the general staff were apprehensive. In violation of the Versailles Treaty, Hitler had ordered the army into the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland. On March 12, 1938, German forces moved into Austria. Neither Great Britain nor France had intervened. But that changed when Hitler set his sights on Czechoslovakia. Several prominent Germans, including Karl Friedrich Goerdler, the former mayor of Leipzig, traveled to London to convince Britain to stand firm against Hitler's demands for Czechoslovakia.
He thought that the single way of preventing a new war in Europe would be that the Western Allies, in particular the United Kingdom, would strongly set a benchmark and tell Hitler there is no go beyond this line.
The British didn't quite know what to make of this. Are they telling us the truth? Are there really more people like that in the German General Staff? They weren't themselves prepared to go to war, so they really didn't act on it.
From the point of view of the British, the line taken there was, let the Germans do something themselves. It's not for us to get them out of their problem through a world war.
During the infamous Munich conference, Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain gave in to Hitler's demands. The western part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, was ceded to Germany without a shot being fired.
So after Munich, he was at the heights of his power. He had regained all of the German-speaking territories which had been contested before, except those in Poland, and it would be fair to say that very few people felt that he should be removed.
On March 15th, 1939, Hitler finally overreached. He ordered troops into Prague in a direct violation of the Munich Accords. Next, he ordered the preparation of Fall Weiss, Case White, the invasion of Poland. This time, Britain and France saw Hitler for what he was and warned Hitler that any move against Poland would inevitably lead to a new world war. As the last days of peace ticked away, Hitler delivered a stunning coup. A non-aggression pact with his arch-enemy, the Soviet Union. With one brilliant stroke, the Führer had removed the threat to the Wehrmacht's right flank. The invasion of Poland followed on September 1st, 1939. England and France declared war against Germany 2 days later.
And on September 17th, actually the day in which they cut the country in two, the Russians come in from the east. So the war ends very shortly, and it's a complete and total victory for the Wehrmacht. The British and the French don't really do anything. They're not mobilized, they don't have troops ready to go, and so they simply sit and watch even though they've declared war.
Hitler's position was now unassailable. In late 1939, Hitler traveled to Munich for the annual commemoration of his failed putsch of 1923. Surprisingly, he only gave a short talk and then left abruptly in order to catch a train back to Berlin. 13 minutes later, a bomb went off in a pillar right behind where Hitler had stood just moments before. The bomb had been placed by a lone assassin named Georg Elser. 8 people were killed, but Hitler had miraculously escaped. On May 10, 1940, Hitler unleashed a new form of warfare known as Blitzkrieg, German armored spearheads, supported by swarms of Luftwaffe planes, pushed through the Ardennes and caught French and English forces by surprise. At the same time, German divisions also launched an attack on the Netherlands and Belgium. Rudi Rosenberg, a young Jewish boy living in Brussels, remembers.
The British had a treaty with Belgium that it would come to the help of Belgium if Belgium was invaded, and Belgium indeed was invaded. A couple of days later, I could tell something was wrong. The British were beginning to pack up, and all over Brussels you could hear explosions. It was the British blowing up the bridges over all the canals and the rivers.
Hitler had achieved in 6 weeks what the Kaiser during World War I had failed to do in 4 years: the defeat of France. Only England now stood in the way of total Nazi domination of Europe. Back in the Berghof, Hitler's private alpine retreat near Berchtesgaden, the Führer was jubilant. The small resistance movement in the Wehrmacht was demoralized.
They could see the regime for what it was, but it was very difficult for them to act without trying to sell something to the public. And while Hitler was marching from success to success on the battlefield, it was very, very difficult for them to do that.
Hitler now began to plot against the Soviet Union. The military leadership had strong misgivings, but Hitler's recent victories gave him an aura of invincibility. Fall Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR, was launched on June 22nd. But Hitler made the mistake of parceling his forces out over 3 different thrusts. One toward the north and Leningrad, one toward the south and the oil fields of the Caucasus, and one much reduced central thrust towards Moscow. After initial successes, the Russian invasion soon faltered at the onset of winter. The central thrust petered out with the spires of Moscow in view. Morale plunged. Brauchitsch resigned. Rather than replace him, Hitler assumed personal control of all military operations in the East. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor.
A date which will live in infamy.
Overnight, the United States became a major combatant in the war. The spirit of the resistance in the German Wehrmacht soared. Beck began to seek out new members of the opposition force.
People like Beck realised Germany's only chance was to try and attain some kind of peace with the West and then hopefully stem the tide in the East.
One of the officers approached by Beck was General Olbricht, chief of the Army General Services Office and adjutant to General Fromm. the commander of the Reserve Army, with offices at the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin. Also in Berlin was a young officer serving on the general staff of the German High Command, named Klaus Schenk, Count von Stauffenberg. The von Stauffenberg family was one of the oldest and most distinguished aristocratic families of southern Germany. Both Klaus's father, Alfred, and his mother, Caroline, were aristocrats of high rank.
There were many small kingdoms and principalities in Germany at the time. And his father was the Lord Chamberlain of the King of Württemberg. And his mother was a lady in waiting to Queen Charlotte of Württemberg.
Caroline had already presented her husband with two sons, the twins Berthold and Alexander. In November of 1907, when she was 8 months into her next pregnancy, she decided to travel to Stauffenberg Castle in Jettingen.
Seine Mutter hat ihre Schwiegermutter hier besucht und dabei kam dann Klaus eben auf die Welt und ein Bruder von ihm, Konrad, es waren auch Zwillinge, genau wie die ersten Brüder von ihm, waren ja auch Zwillinge.
Konrad died shortly after birth, but Klaus survived. For the next 10 years, the three sons grew up in the privileged comfort of the German nobility under Kaiser Wilhelm II.
So he grew up as a young fellow in this royal atmosphere, and they had a small family castle of their own in Lautlingen, so he was born and raised in a very aristocratic atmosphere.
But young Klaus was a sickly child. He had few friends, but developed a close bond with his elder brother Berthold. In 1914, war broke out, and Germany declared war on both France and Russia. Caroline made a point of taking tea to the soldiers passing through the local train station, and in the summer urged her sons to help the local women, now deprived of their menfolk, with the harvest. The boys were tutored at the estate, and later attended school in Stuttgart. In his spare time, Klaus read and learned to play the cello, so that he and his brothers could perform trio sonatas by Mozart and Haydn. One day, they learned that Germany had requested an armistice. Klaus was in tears.
And he was, of course, still a boy when that war ended, in Germany's defeat and in the national, what was so seen by so many people, including Stauffenberg's family, as the national humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919.
Germany was in a state of siege, as various mobs, communist or right-wing, jockeyed for power. The political upheaval of those years made a powerful impression on Klaus. He resolved to become an officer, for he believed that the officer corps had always served as a powerful stabilizing force in German life. In 1926, he joined the family's traditional regiment, the 17th Cavalry Regiment in Bamberg.
And then the Stauffenberg voluntarily joined another circle, that of poet Stefan George, who formed quite an elitist circle of his own, the so-called Geheimes Deutschland, or Secret Germany.
And there the notion was of a Germany which would be led by a type of aesthetic elite, whose purpose it was to bring about a renewal of Germany from within.
Klaus enthusiastically embraced George's teachings. For him, the poet's circle embodied the hope that one day the secret Germany would rise and rebuild the fatherland as the proud monarchy it once was. Klaus had grown to be a tall and strikingly handsome young man, with a shock of dark hair, prominent cheekbones, a firm jaw, and dreamy, romantic eyes.
Ein sehr, sehr beeindruckender Mensch. Er hat eine ganz große Ausstrahlung gehabt. Er war irgendwie sehr, sehr herzlich, sehr auf jemanden zugehend.
A very devout Catholic, he always made sure to attend Mass on Sunday.
Irgendwo war eine Zeit lang in Bamberg stationiert beim Reiterregiment 17, wo er auch eingetreten ist. Und da lag ganz nah von Bamberg lag der Besitz meines Großvaters und war dann, sagen wir, ich war dann auch immer wieder eingeladen zu dem Winterball in Bamberg beim Regiment.
One day, he met a pretty young 16-year-old who was attending a local girls' boarding school by the name of Nina. Her actual name was Baroness Elisabeth von Lerchenfeld. In 1930, after he had been promoted to second lieutenant, Klaus proposed to Nina, even though he was only 23.
Und als sie sich dann entschlossen haben, sich offiziell zu verloben und zu heiraten, stieß es überhaupt nicht auf Begeisterung bei der Mutter meines Großvaters, weil man natürlich als Offizier überhaupt viel zu wenig verdient hat. Und die Mutter meines Großvaters, genannt Dolly, hat also versucht, ihrer Gegenschwieger das irgendwie auszureden. Das sei völlig unsinnig. Und dann hat aber die Mutter meiner Großmutter in den höchsten Tönen gesagt, aber sie haben sich schon geküsst.
Nina accepted his marriage proposal, even though the couple knew that army rules forbade him to marry until Klaus was either 27 or had completed 8 years of service. In 1923, Germany's Weimar Republic had been hit hard by rampant inflation. Money earned by a worker at the end of the week was often worthless by the time his wife tried to spend it at the shops. In the early 1930s, the global depression once again hit Germany's Weimar Republic.
Wir wollen nichts anderes als Friede, wollen nichts anderes als Ruhe, wollen nichts anderes.
The turmoil prepared the way for the rise of the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler. Stauffenberg found that the teachings of Stefan George had much in common with German National Socialism and supported Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. Some said his reaction was enthusiastic.
He was one of those who, you know, the general atmosphere amongst those circles in Germany was that they supported the Nazis in as far as the Nazis promised a sort of re-emergence of Germany, a renaissance for Germany on the world stage, and an end to the sort of humiliation that Germany had suffered at the end of the First World War.
Personally, I think that perhaps for some time this very esoteric circle of Stefan George may have blinded Stauffenberg for some time to the cruel realities of his country. Many other resistors, many people who later on became Stauffenberg's fellow conspirators, were aware of the evil of Hitler much earlier than Stauffenberg was.
On September 26, 1933, 8 months after Hitler became Chancellor, Nina and Klaus were wed at St. James Church in Bamberg, having received special dispensation to marry early. He was in uniform and wore his steel helmet to the ceremony. To wed is to be on duty, he explained to Nina. The couple then took the train to Rome and honeymooned in the Eternal City before moving on to Verona and Florence. In 1936, Claus von Stauffenberg took the entrance exams to Berlin's prestigious War Academy. Here, students were trained in new military technology, such as high-trajectory artillery, aviation, and the tactical use of Panzer, or tanks. Berthold von Stauffenberg had also moved to Berlin with his new wife Mika, while his cousin, Count Cäsar von Hoffaker, lived in Berlin on the Kaiser Wilhelm Strasse.
My father was a direct cousin of Count Klaus Stauffenberg. My grandmother and the mother of Klaus Stauffenberg were sisters. So there was a very close relationship. And I think that had definitely something to do that my father ended up in the resistance.
At the academy, his high marks earned Klaus a stipend to travel to Britain, and in the summer of 1936, he spent a week touring London, visiting Westminster Abbey and other famous landmarks. His military career now progressed rapidly. In 1937, he became a cavalry captain, and in 1938, he was assigned as a general staff officer to the 1st Light Division, later known as the 6th Panzer Division. That same year, the SA and SS launched the so-called Kristallnacht, when shops and homes of Jews were smashed and many synagogues were burned to the ground.
Da war ich 8 damals. In dem Zusammenhang haben sie ja auch jüdische Wohnungen gestürmt, haben die Sachen rausgeschmissen auf die Straße, haben sie verbrannt, haben geplündert.
Stauffenberg had supported restricting Jewish influence in the arts and public life, but he strongly condemned this action. Still, when he was approached by high-ranking officers, including his uncle, about a plot to overthrow Hitler, he declined. And yet, the gradual disillusionment with the Nazi regime had irrevocably begun. Stauffenberg was serving as quartermaster of the 1st Light Division when Hitler decided to invade Poland in September of 1939. Meeting stiff resistance at times, the division made rapid progress, and within 14 days had captured virtually all of its objectives.
He said in response to one attempt to motivate him to help overthrow Hitler in November 1939, "I'm not ready yet." What does that mean? He was a captain at the time. He was a captain in the general staff. How many opportunities to oppose a dictator and a commander-in-chief are open to a captain?
Stauffenberg's entire ethos was that the army was there to uphold and defend Germany, and therefore he was a very loyal member of the army that went into Poland in 1939. Germany was now in a war. This was the regime that was leading Germany, and he, I think, believed to some extent this war had been in a way forced upon Germany, that it wasn't solely down to Hitler's crazy foreign policy.
The German High Command reports on September the 21st of 1939, 170,000 prisoners, 320 guns and 40 tanks captured.
Stauffenberg was praised for his expert management of ammunition and provisions, and later that November was promoted to the division's general staff. By that time, Hitler was already plotting the invasion of the Low Countries and France. On May 10th, Stauffenberg was with 6th Panzer as its tanks plunged into Luxembourg and Belgium, creating the spearhead of the 6 armored divisions that crossed the Meuse and raced across France. French resistance crumbled more quickly than division headquarters in the rear could keep track of. 1 week later, to his infinite disappointment, Stauffenberg was withdrawn from the front and promoted to the Army General Staff. Before taking up his new post, Stauffenberg found time to reconnect with his family. He was now the proud father of 3 children, Franz Ludwig, Heimeron, and Berthold, named after his elder brother. 1 year later, Nina would present him with their 4th, a girl named Valkyrie. From his perch at the Army General Staff, Stauffenberg witnessed the invasion of the Soviet Union. But it was not until later in 1941 that news of the systematic killing of Jews and Gypsies by SS troops reached the higher levels of the Wehrmacht.
Und dann bin ich verwundet worden vor Moskau und kam dann, weil ich noch nicht frontverwendungsfähig war, als Ordnanzoffizier zur Crew. Und dort kam eine der ersten Meldungen aus dem rückwärtigen Bereich, was der SS unterstand, eben diese Meldung am Schluss der ganzen Meldungen, er hätte 5 Zigeuner sonderbehandelt. Sie hatten da 5 Zigeuner sonderbehandelt. Was haben Sie mit denen gemacht? Ja, die haben wir erschossen. Wieso erschossen? Nach einem Kriegsgericht die Urteil? Nein. Alle Zigeuner und Juden erschießen wir. Das war das erste Mal, dass ich das authentisch gehört hatte von einem hohen SS-Führer, der zuständig war. Das hat mich sehr umgetrieben.
You know, in the early days of the Russian campaign, the Holocaust was ongoing at that point, and it tended to be a very, very brutal affair. This is not the later supposedly humane gassings at Auschwitz and everything else. This was very, very brutal. Pits dug and civilians lined up and shot into them. So it was dreadful what was going on, and reports of each of these atrocities would obviously go up through the military lines.
If one looks at the total number of Jews, for example, who are exterminated in the Holocaust, by far the largest number come from what was the former Soviet Union, in Belarus, in Ukraine, and places like that. And those are the areas that the Germans occupy in the summer and fall of 1941. And truly horrible things happened there, large-scale killings and the like.
Da hat es der Major von Gersdorf und noch einer, die im Hubschrauber über die Gegenstadt geflogen waren, gesehen, wie ein riesigen Grab war und da Leute erschossen wurden. Es wurden dann 8000 Juden, hatte die lettische SS erschossen. Ich war damals 25 Jahre alt. Wen sollte ich fragen? Ach, da kam nur der Oberst von Tresco in Frage. Das war ein väterlicher Freund, 1A der Heeresgruppe, also Geschäftsführer des Stabes, wenn man so sagen will.
Major General Henning von Tresco, who was serving on the Eastern Front in the Heeresgruppe Mitte, had been plotting Hitler's overthrow since the early 1930s.
War wohl ein sehr brillanter Denker, sehr klar. War ein Womanizer, das ist gar keine Frage. Muss eine sehr starke Ausstrahlung gehabt haben. Insofern hat es mich immer sehr erstaunt, dass sich so jemand, bei dem eigentlich eine militärische Karriere auch gerade innerhalb eines solchen Systems sehr stark vorgegeben war, sich aktiv entscheidet, etwas zu tun, was, sagen wir mal, dieser Karriere vorsichtig gesagt zumindest nicht förderlich gewesen ist.
Und da gab es damals so eine Sprache, die man sich angewöhnt hat, wo man rausfand, ob einer Nazi war oder nicht. Und ich wusste, er war kein Nazi. Ich bewunderte seine Intelligenz. Und dann ging man so um 11 Uhr abends so rüber. Da war Tresco häufig am Schachspiel zur Erholung, seiner Erholung. Und dann wurde besprochen, wie das Attentat durchgeführt wurde. Wie ich hinkam, 1942, war gar keine Frage mehr, das ein Attentat, sondern nur wie.
Von Tresco understood that the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front had a unique opportunity to incubate a conspiracy, given its independence from the SD, the Gestapo, and the SS. In July of 1941, von Tresco received a visitor from the General Staff, Stauffenberg. The young officer agreed with Tresco that Hitler was a danger, but he was not yet ready to join the conspiracy, as he explained to his brother Bertold.
We must win the war first. In war, one cannot do that sort of thing. But afterwards, when we go home, we will clean up that brown plague.
As late as the summer and fall of 1942, during one of his fact-finding tours in the Ukraine, Stauffenberg remained convinced that the Eastern Front could be held.
There's no question that the Soviet Union was on the point of collapse after the battles of Kiev and Bryansk. But when we were ready to exploit the success, the bad weather came back.
But in that same year, Stauffenberg received the first reports of the mass murder of Russian Jews by SS special forces known as Einsatztruppen.
And he got wind of these and was astonished and horrified that this was going on in Germany's name. And in effect, as I say, I think that is where his real conversion to the cause comes from.
Some of his religious background, as a Catholic, there's always a greater authority. Yeah, there's a greater authority than your Führer. Yeah, all this came together then and made a loyal member of the officer caste into a rebel.
He began a one-man campaign to convince commanders at the Eastern Front to try to confront Hitler and wrest control from him. So I would date his active resistance from April 1942.
Or motivated to make that switch from general, non-specific opposition to active opposition and even to the point of plotting to assassinate Hitler. To my mind, it's the Holocaust that is actually decisive. It's knowledge of what was going on in Germany's name.
In the months to come, von Tresco would emerge as the dominant force in the opposition against the Führer.
Er hat innerhalb der Heeresgruppe Mitte eigentlich versucht, ein Zentrum zu sammeln von Leuten, auf die er sich verlassen konnte. Das war eigenartigerweise auch relativ bekannt.
He, in effect, turned his command into a sort of a nest of resistance. He attracted officers, or he would seek out officers that he suspected were of like mind, and he would bring them into his circle.
You're not part of the system yet, like generals are. Generals are bought off. Generals were bought off all the time by Hitler. Yeah, they were promised estates in the East, hunting estates. They were given cash bonuses. They were bought off.
That winter of 1942, the German army came to a halt before the gates of Stalingrad. Even when the 6th Army under General von Paulus faced certain defeat, Hitler refused to authorize a withdrawal.
Mein einziger Bruder ist in Stalingrad geblieben und mein Mann hat immer die letzten Funksprüche, die von der Armee kamen, von Paulus zum Hauptquartier Ost kamen, die hat er uns immer nach meiner Mutter und mir durchgesprochen. Die haben wir alle gekriegt, das war so schrecklich. Und der ist auch vermisst, also mein Bruder ist nie wieder nach Hause gekommen. Also eine ganze Armee opferte aus Prestigegründen.
Stauffenberg was now convinced that Hitler had to be removed. He was so vocal in his criticism that his fellow officers became concerned. It was decided to post him far away, to the 10th Panzer Division in Tunisia.
Which obviously is away from the Holocaust, is away from the SS. There was no SS involvement in North Africa. And I think that was an idea, in effect, to save him from opening his mouth in front of someone and getting into trouble.
Gün dolandı dağı taşı dinmiyor.
In Libya and Tunisia, the victories of the famed Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel had been reversed. The Americans had landed in North Africa during Operation Torch. Rommel launched a daring panzer attack against the still inexperienced American troops, driving all the way to the Kasselen Pass. But the victory was short-lived. The Germans began a fighting retreat. On April 7th, Stauffenberg tried to lead his column through the narrow El Hafai Pass. Fighter bombers caught up with him. Stauffenberg was severely injured. He was taken to a field hospital in Sfax, where he lost his right hand, 2 fingers on his left hand, as well as his left eye.
It was kind of a turning point for him. When I saw him in the hospital in Munich, he said, "It is time for me to save the German Reich." And I replied, "Well, you're in ideal shape to do that now." I thought he was joking, but in hindsight, that was the moment he chose to become involved.
His recovery was slow but steady. On July 5th, he arrived back in Laudlingen for a month-long convalescence. Here he was reunited with his children, Heimeran, Franz Ludwig, and little Valerie, as well as his niece Elizabeth and nephew Alfred. Around that time, the position of Chief of Staff of the General Army Office in the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin became vacant. General Olbricht, well aware of Stauffenberg's commitment to remove Hitler, quickly arranged for Stauffenberg to be offered the post. Stauffenberg immediately agreed. In the early months of 1943, Tresco and his circle had launched a number of attempts to assassinate Hitler. One was a plan to place a bomb on the Führer's aircraft.
Es glückte dem Tresco, 2 als Cognacflasche getarnte Bomben in das Flugzeug zu bringen. Man wusste aber nicht, dass die Zünder sehr frostempfindlich waren und da die Bombe unten im Frachtraum deponiert war, explodierten die nicht.
Unfortunately, the fuse either malfunctioned or it was the wrong type of fuse, but it didn't work. It didn't explode. And then, of course, he had the problem of trying to retrieve his bomb before the recipient of the brandy bottles realised that they weren't brandy bottles at all. And he managed to do that, so the plot was never actually uncovered.
In March of 1943, Hitler prepared to come to the arsenal in Berlin to mark the Heroes' Day.
Hitler always paraded, always went through the room, inspected a parade of captured booty and so on.
And his guide through this exhibition was Gersdorff. And Gersdorff had these 2, or in effect, British clam mines in his pockets.
Es war genau geplant, eine halbe Stunde, alles war fix und fertig und der Gersdorff wollte auch ein Selbstmordattentat machen.
Unfortunately, Hitler had very little interest in the exhibition.
On this occasion, he raced through it so that there was no possibility of actually trying to assassinate him on that occasion.
Mit dem Gersdorff mit Mühe die Bombe wieder zu entschärfen, aber Hitler war weg. Das waren 3 Attentatsversuche innerhalb von 8 Tagen. Das war sehr deprimierend.
The Valkyrie plan was an official German plan for dealing with some sort of massive internal disturbance within Germany, whether it might be an uprising of foreign labourers or a particularly concentrated air raid which sort of disrupts local services and everything else.
It turns out that in 1944 there were 7.5 million foreign workers in Germany. And the Germans had this worry that there could be a civil disturbance.
Unter dem Motto Valkyrie war geplant, ein Aufstand, falls ein Aufstand der Fremdarbeiter käme. Fremdarbeiter in allen Betrieben, Landwirtschaft, Industrie, gab es sehr viele ausländische Arbeiter. Wenn die einen Aufstand planten, sollte der mit dem, unter dem Stichwort Valkyrie niedergeschlagen werden. Da hat in jedem Korps waren Vorbereitungen getroffen für diesen Zweck.
Now the interesting thing was that the circles of the resistance in the Home Army in the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin were the ones that were in control of that plan. So it seemed very logical for them to turn that operational plan to their own to their own devices.
In August of 1943, Stauffenberg arranged to meet with Henning von Tresckow to discuss the implementation of the Valkyrie plan. They began to draft an outline of the new government that was to take charge immediately after the coup d'etat. General Ludwig Beck would become the head of state. Longtime resistor Karl Friedrich Girdler would become Germany's new chancellor. Von Tresckow would take control of all German security services, including Himmler's Gestapo and SD. General Heppner would become head of the Ministry of War. Either Olbricht or Stauffenberg himself would serve him as state secretary. The only minister in Hitler's government which the plotters intended to retain, if he agreed, was the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer. Under his leadership, armaments production had actually increased despite the devastating British and American bombing campaigns.
I interviewed Albert Speer, and indeed he knew that he had been penciled in to become Minister of War in the new government had Hitler been assassinated, and all of that had been carried off successfully.
And of course Stauffenberg had been away from Berlin, and only when he was called to Berlin in order to become the Chief of Staff, first of the Allgemeines Heeresamt, only then did he need an apartment in Berlin. And the two brothers had an apartment in a villa in Tristanstraße in Wannsee. It still exists. It's a very nice villa.
Stauffenberg increasingly became the soul and spirit of the Valkyrie plan. But one major problem remained. Nor von Tresckow or other conspirators, such as Merz von Kirnheim, had actual access to the Führer.
So again, it brings us back to this problem that they always had of access. It was very difficult to get access to Hitler. But Hitler always, said that his survival was due to providence. Now, he was talking about the assassination attempts that he knew about, and there were an awful lot that actually he didn't know about at all. And it's very interesting that it wasn't, in the vast majority of cases, it wasn't his security that protected him. It was purely bad luck.
But then, in June of 1944, Stauffenberg was appointed as Chief of Staff to none other than General Fromm, head of the Home Army. And because Hitler frequently wanted to be appraised of its combat readiness, Stauffenberg suddenly found himself in a position where he himself would see Hitler on an ongoing basis. Of all the conspirators, he was now best placed to become the assassin. The keen interest in the status of the Reserve Army was prompted by the successful Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944. For the time being, the Allied armies were bottled up in the peninsula, but it was only a matter of time before they would break out. Knowing this, Field Marshal Rommel, commander of Army Group B in France, had finally agreed to cooperate with the conspiracy, which in the West was headed by the military governor of France, General von Stulpnagel. The success of Valkyrie therefore depended heavily on Stulpnagel and his deputy, none other than Stauffenberg's cousin, Caesar von Hofecker.
Stulpnagel was his immediate boss, and I think my father and Stulpnagel were very good friends at the end.
Another key figure in the conspiracy was General von Hase, city commander of Berlin.
Hatte unterstand ihm ja der Valkyrie-Befehl und hatte Truppen, und mit diesen Truppen sollte zum Beispiel Goebbels festnehmen. Diesen Befehl durchzuführen, hatte den Oberst Rehmer, der ihm unterstand, beauftragt, Goebbels festzunehmen.
Where the plot began to fall down was that Stauffenberg couldn't be in two places at once. He was instrumental in organising the operation of Valkyrie in Berlin, so he needed to be there. And he was a tremendously powerful, dynamic man, so he could, pick up the phone and talk to all corners of Germany at once and convince everybody to act in the way that they should do. But at the same time, he realised that summer that he actually had to be the assassin as well. So he also had to be 300 miles to the east, planting the bomb in the map room in Rastenburg.
Since Stauffenberg had to remain alive and return to Berlin to orchestrate the coup, he had to use a timer in the form of a fuse.
Und wir haben diese Versuche gemacht, dänische, französische, belgische, alle Sprengstoffe, die es in Europa praktisch gab. Und die habe ich ausprobiert und habe dann nach einer Weile gemeldet, ohne jeden Drang und ohne jeden Druck. Der englische wäre der beste und die Zünder auch, weil die Zünder leise waren, die konnte man nicht hören. Die anderen zischten. Und habe auch gemerkt, man müsste 2 Bomben gebrauchen mit 2 Zündern, also je einen Zünder, weil immer wieder eine Versager wäre. Aber mit 2 Bomben wäre man sicher.
Stauffenberg's co-conspirator, General Helmut Stief, secured the necessary bombs and fuses from Lieutenant von Berslager.
Hast du auch noch Englischen? Ja. Ja, dann pack den Handkoffer voll und bring den dem Stief. Da wusste ich, was los war. Da habe ich meinen Handkoffer genommen, so einen Wäschekoffer, wie man damals hatte, so einen Lederkoffer. Habe den vollgepackt mit englischen Bömmchen, das waren so Plastikdinger, viereckig, so ungefähr 2 Zentimeter hoch. Und die entsprechenden Zünder, habe den vollgepackt und bin also dann zum Stief geflogen.
The ultimate objective of Valkyrie was to decapitate the German leadership. Field Marshals von Kluge and Rommel insisted that not only Hitler, but also Himmler, head of the SS, and Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, should be removed as well. The problem was that these 3 men rarely met at the same conference. On July 11th, Stauffenberg traveled to the Berghof with Stief. They were ready to detonate the bomb. But neither Himmler nor Göring were present. Stief decided to call it off. Three days later, Hitler moved his headquarters from the Berghof to Wolfschanze. Originally built in 1941 in preparation for Barbarossa, Wolfschanze had since been expanded into a vast complex comprising 3 security rings. The first complex, known as Security Zone 2, contained barracks and facilities for the staff as well as guests, a communication center, and a mess hall known as Casino 2. To the northeast lay Security Zone 1, containing the offices of top figures in the Nazi leadership, including Göring, General Jodl, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. To the immediate left of Zone 1 was another highly guarded sector known as the Führer Zone. Here was a huge bunker reserved for the Führer, as well as air raid shelters and various wooden barracks, one of which contained a map situation room. On July 14th, Stauffenberg and General Fromm were summoned to appear at Wolfschanze the next day. In this famous photo, Stauffenberg stands ramrod straight as Hitler greets General Bodenschatz of the Luftwaffe. Back in Berlin, General Olbricht was already issuing orders for Valkyrie, but Stauffenberg was once again prevented from setting the bombs because Himmler and Göring were not in attendance. But July 15th gave Stauffenberg the opportunity of a dress rehearsal. He saw that the chance of activating the bomb in the Führer bunker itself was slim. He would thus have to break the fuses somewhere outside, preferably in Keitel's office complex. He also saw that the distance between the 2 buildings was about 400 yards, which would take around 10 minutes on foot. A 10-minute fuse, therefore, wouldn't do. He would need 30-minute fuses. Over the next few days, however, the plot began to unravel. On July 17th, Rommel was badly injured in a strafing attack. The next day, a rumor began to circulate in Berlin that Wolfschanze was about to be blown up. The security services were closing in. Treschow urged Stauffenberg to proceed come what may. Stauffenberg agreed. On the morning of July 20th, 1944, a Heinkel 111 carrying Stauffenberg and von Haften arrives at Rostenburg, the small airport serving Wolfschanze. Security is tight. Major Herbert Buchs remembers the mood at the Führer headquarters.
In the east, the situation was extremely critical. Also, the weather was very hot and the humidity high, conditions that Hitler didn't like. The overall mood in the Wolfschanze was tense.
I didn't know that my husband was going to try the assassination himself. He did tell me that in case an attempt should fail, I shouldn't try to be loyal to him. The most important thing was, he said, that one of us should survive to look after the children.
Stauffenberg sits down for breakfast. Joining him is Captain von Mellendorf, adjutant to the Wolfschanze commander. Shortly after 11, accompanied by von Haften, Stauffenberg proceeds to the office of Wilhelm Keitel in preparation for the presentation to the Führer. Here, Stauffenberg receives some disturbing news. The conference will not take place in the bunker as usual, but in a wooden building reinforced with concrete known as the Lagerbaracke, or Situation Room. Shortly thereafter, Keitel is told that the briefing has been rescheduled for 12:30 p.m., giving the pending visit of Mussolini. He decides that they should get over to the conference room as soon as possible. The bomb must be activated immediately. Stauffenberg asks where he can change his shirt. Von Freyen takes the officers to a nearby bedroom. Once inside the room, Haften and Stauffenberg feverishly begin to activate the bomb. Stauffenberg uses a special pair of pliers to squeeze the casings of the British fuse. Haften then takes the fuse to insert it in the bomb. This is when Voss tries to open the door to tell Stauffenberg of his phone call. Von Haften has just finished activating the first bomb, but the second fuse hasn't been crushed yet. Keitel is impatient and tells Stauffenberg to hurry. They've run out of time. One bomb will have to do. Von Freyen offers to carry Stauffenberg's briefcase. Stauffenberg refuses. "I want to sit as close to the Führer as possible," he says. "My hearing is very bad." When they reach the conference room, Hitler is listening to a report by General Adolf Heusinger, a friend of Treschow's, and the only general in the room who is aware that a plot to kill Hitler is brewing. To Heusinger's right is Colonel Heinz Brandt. General Rudolf Schmund, the senior adjutant. Colonel Heinrich Borgmann of the Wehrmacht. And a stenographer, Berger, as well as other officers. To Hitler's left is General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, and his deputy, General Varlamov. Neither Goering nor Himmler are present, but Stauffenberg knows he must proceed with the plan. Von Freyen now steps forward and asks Oberst von Brandt to move aside so that Stauffenberg can be closer to Hitler. With the bomb in place, Stauffenberg tells von Freyend that he has to make a phone call and leaves. Fatefully, Brandt moves back into his old spot. Once outside of the building, Stauffenberg quickly makes his way out of the Führer zone to the adjutant's building, where he knows General Feldgiebel will be waiting for him. Back in the conference room, Heusinger's presentation continues. The seconds tick by.
Glass and wood splinters shot through the air. The large table on which all the situation maps were spread collapsed. After a few seconds of silence, I heard a voice saying, "Where's the Führer?"
In the turmoil that follows, Stauffenberg and von Haften try to make their escape. As they pass the site of the situation barracks, Stauffenberg sees a corpse covered with Hitler's long trench coat being carried out on a stretcher. At the first security ring, and later the second checkpoint, they are allowed to proceed. But by now, the Wolfschanze commandant has ordered a complete lockdown. At the last checkpoint, Stauffenberg is stopped. He decides to call the commander himself. By coincidence, he is put in touch with Captain von Mellendorf, the very officer with whom he had breakfast earlier that morning. Von Mellendorf gives him the go-ahead to leave the compound. On the way to the airport, von Haften opens his briefcase and throws the second bomb into the forest. Their Heinkel takes off at 1:15 p.m. But because of strong headwinds, Stauffenberg and von Haften will not reach the Bendlerstrasse until 4:30 in the afternoon. Back in Wolfschanze, Feldgiebel notices that something is very wrong. A rumor is going around that Hitler is very much alive and only slightly injured. Although a communications blackout is in effect, the news reaches Bendlerstrasse that the plot may have failed. General Olbricht decides to wait with launching Valkyrie until Stauffenberg can report in person. When Stauffenberg lands in Berlin, he finds that nothing has been done. Precious hours have been wasted, during which the conspirators still had the element of surprise. General Fromm, commander of the Home Army, resolutely refuses to activate Plan Valkyrie. He says that he just spoke with Keitel and was told that the Führer is very much alive. Stauffenberg counters that he saw Hitler's corpse with his own eyes and that the news from Wolfschanze is a trick. Anxious to wash his hands of the entire affair, Fromm orders all the conspirators to be placed under arrest. But Stauffenberg is one step ahead of him and places Fromm under arrest instead. Together with Olbricht and Merz von Quernheim, Stauffenberg frantically begins to issue the telex orders to the various army units, urging them to move to their assigned locations. Fortunately, in Paris, all goes according to plan.
My father went ahead and arrested all the major people of the SS and the Gestapo in Paris. And then they had the problem to solve because General Field Marshal Kluge, who was the head of the military in France, he had known about the resistance, but he had not definitely decided. And then there's that famous word, Kluge, that's very often cited, "Gentlemen, as long as that pig lives, I cannot." And you know that Kluge committed suicide just 4 weeks after that. So my father and Stauffenberg went back to Paris, and they had to open the prison doors.
The clatter of typewriters in Bendlerstrasse come to a halt when Radio Berlin issues a communique. There had been an attack on the Führer's life, but Hitler is alive and will speak on the radio shortly. Why did the plot fail? Not one, but a sequence of events had doomed the conspiracy. The first factor was von Freyen's decision to place Stauffenberg to the right of Hitler, next to Heusinger. When, later, Brandt kicked his foot against the briefcase, he moved it to the right of the wooden post, which then served to shield Hitler from the blast. Had Stauffenberg been placed to Hitler's left, it is possible that the blast would have injured Hitler far more severely, possibly fatally. Significantly, all of the officers who were killed in the blast were standing to the right of the briefcase bomb, unshielded by any of the wooden posts. The second setback was the phone call from Feldgiebel, compounded by Keitel's impatience, which prevented the plotters from activating the second bomb. If Stauffenberg had been able to place both bombs in the conference room, the likelihood is great that Hitler would have been killed. But the most important factor was the decision to move the meeting from the bunker to the wooden conference room. Had the bomb exploded within the concrete confines of the bunker, the blast would have been contained, and everyone in the room would undoubtedly have been killed. Hitler was convinced that he had been saved by Providence. Shaking hands with his left arm, since his right arm was hurt in the explosion, he proudly welcomed his guest, Italy's ex-dictator Benito Mussolini.
As Hitler showed Mussolini the ruins of the barracks, he said, "You see, there's nothing left of it, and yet I got out without a scratch." In truth, he had injured his shoulder, so he put his right hand between the buttons of his tunic, like Napoleon. Until then, everyone was convinced that it must have been one of the laborers working on the barracks, but the sudden disappearance of Stauffenberg put things in an entirely different light. By that evening, Hitler knew that a clique of army officers had been responsible.
Back in Berlin, the final act had begun. Major Raymer, who had defied von Haase's orders, had arranged his troops around the Bendlerstrasse. The conspirators were surrounded. Soon thereafter, Raymer's forces were relieved by the SS. Valkyrie was lost. Fromm was released and promptly ordered the conspirators to be placed under arrest. Eager to cover up his complicity, Fromm decided to dispose of the conspirators immediately so that none of them could implicate him in the investigation that was sure to follow. Stauffenberg, Haften, Ulbricht, and Quernheim were summarily condemned to death. An execution detail was formed, lit by the headlights of the SS vehicles. They were then marched down the courtyard of the Bendler block. At the same time, Hitler was making his radio address from Wolfschanze.
Ganz lange Autoschöpfung und Verbrennung. Ich fasse das als eine Bestätigung des Auftrags der Vorstellung auf, mein Lebensziel weiter zu verfolgen, so wie ich es bisher getan habe.
It was 1 a.m. on the morning of July 21st, 1944. In the end, fate had been merciful to Klaus von Stauffenberg. Many other senior officers were not so lucky. The attempt convinced Hitler that the Wehrmacht leadership could not be trusted. He launched a purge of the officer corps and used the shock of the attack to also round up all the surviving members of the old opposition in the Reichstag. The day of revenge had dawned. At the same time, those officers who had been injured or killed by the bomb were hailed as heroes. General Schmundt, General Korten, Colonel Brandt, and the stenographer Dr. Berger were given a state funeral, presided by Goering. Hitler personally went to the Rostenburg hospital to pay his respects to the officers who had been wounded by the blast. Hitler ordered a series of show trials in the Volksgerichtshof, or People's Court, presided by a dreaded judge named Roland Freisler.
Like common murderers, they were led into the courtroom. You could tell from their appearance that all the defendants, after the torture they had suffered during interrogation, longed for only one thing, an early end to this physical and mental torment.
Even high-ranking officers, like Field Marshal von Witzleben, were forced to wear shabby, ill-fitting clothes to strip them of their former dignity.
Mein Mann hat man dann am selben Tag noch hingerichtet. Und dort durfte er dann das erste Mal und das letzte Mal noch Abschiedsbriefe schreiben. Und hat das auch getan. Er hat einen zweiten geschrieben, weil er sagte, es sind noch 5 Minuten Zeit. Und ich weiß nicht, ob mein erster Brief ankommt, deswegen schreibe ich den nochmal. Und das sind sehr bewegende 5 Minuten vorm Tod geschrieben, sehr bewegende Briefe.
And the war continued. It would go on for another 10 months, in which millions of people would lose their lives.
Brussels is free, liberated from German bondage for the second time in 26 years.
And a man came by on a motorcycle, and he's yelling, "Put out the flags, put out the flags, the British are coming." And in the distance, you could hear cheering. First, very, very low, and then louder and louder. And we knew we were free.